remember it was the autumn of 2015 when this happened. At the time, I was 24 years old and had just taken a job as a night shift security monitor for a sprawling corporate campus in the outskirts of a town in western Washington. It wasn't a high-stakes job. The facility was mostly administrative offices for a logistics company, and my role was essentially to sit in a small glass-walled kiosk at the main gate, check the badges of the few late-night employees, and do a walking perimeter check every 3 hours. It was the kind of job that appealed to me because I've always been a quiet person who enjoys my own company. The silence of the woods surrounding the campus was peaceful, or at least it was for the first few months. The campus was isolated, accessible only by a 2-mile private road that branched off from a secondary highway. Because it was so tucked away, we almost never saw anyone who didn't belong there. If a car came up that road after 10 p.m., it was either a janitor, a stressed-out executive, or someone who was very, very lost. The first time I noticed something unusual was a Tuesday night in late October. It was about 2:15 a.m., and I was finishing my first walk of the night. As I approached the main gate, I saw a pair of headlights at the very end of the long driveway, near the tree line where the private road met the highway. The car wasn't moving, it was just idling there, its lights cutting through the heavy fog that always seemed to roll in during that time of year. I watched it for about 10 minutes, thinking they were just turning around or maybe checking a map, but the car never moved. Then, without warning, the lights flickered off. I felt a slight chill, but I brushed it off. I figured it was just a couple of teenagers looking for a private spot or someone who had pulled over to sleep. I went back into my kiosk, sat down, and returned to my book. But about an hour later, I looked up and realized I could see a faint, rhythmic light reflecting off the trees near where the car had been. It looked like someone was walking through the woods with a flashlight. Our property line was marked with a high chain-link fence, so I wasn't technically worried about an intruder getting to the buildings, but the persistence of the person out there was strange. I kept my eyes on the monitors, but the cameras didn't cover the deep woods, only the immediate perimeter of the offices. The next night, it happened again. At exactly 2:15 a.m., I saw the headlights at the end of the road. This time, they didn't turn off. They stayed on for the entire duration of my shift. I considered calling the local sheriff, but I didn't want to seem like the guy who cried wolf over a parked car on a public adjacent road. I told myself that if they didn't cross the fence, it wasn't my problem. However, when I left work at 6 a.m., I had to drive past that spot to get to the highway. As I approached the end of the driveway, I slowed down, expecting to see a car parked on the shoulder. But there was nothing there. No tire tracks in the damp gravel, no flattened grass. It was as if no one had been there at all. That bothered me more than the lights themselves. I knew what I had seen. I had watched those headlights through my binoculars for hours. A week went by without any sightings, and I started to relax. I convinced myself it was some kind of atmospheric trick, or perhaps a reflection from a distant sign. Then, on a Monday night, I was doing my walking rounds behind the Building C warehouse. This area was the furthest point from the gatehouse and was shrouded in complete darkness, save for a few dim amber security lights. As I walked along the fence line, I heard a sound that made me stop dead in my tracks. It was the sound of someone whistling. It wasn't a frantic or scary whistle. It was a slow, melodic tune, something familiar like a lullaby, but I couldn't quite place it. It was coming from the other side of the fence, deep in the trees. I shined my heavy-duty flashlight toward the sound, but the beam only penetrated a few yards into the thick underbrush. The whistling didn't stop when I shined the light. In fact, it seemed to get slightly louder, as if the person was walking toward the fence. I called out, asking if someone was there and informing them they were on private property. The whistling stopped instantly. The silence that followed was heavy and suffocating. I stood there for what felt like 5 minutes, my heart hammering against my ribs, waiting for a response or the sound of retreating footsteps. Nothing. Just the wind in the pines. I finished my round much faster than usual and locked myself back in the kiosk.
The next night, I arrived at work to find a small gift bag sitting on the counter of the gatehouse. My coworker, Greg, who worked the evening shift, was just packing up his things. I asked him who had left it there. He looked at me confused and said he hadn't noticed it there. He thought I had brought it in with me. I opened the bag, expecting a joke from one of the other guards. Inside was a single silver-plated pocket watch. It was old, tarnished, and the glass face was cracked. When I opened the latch, I saw that the watch wasn't running, but there was a small inscription on the inside of the lid. It wasn't a name, it was a date. My birthday, followed by the year 1991. I didn't tell Greg, I just put the watch in my pocket and felt a cold knot form in my stomach. My birthday isn't something I share with people at work. I don't have social media, and I had only lived in that town for 6 months. I spent the rest of that night staring at the monitors, feeling like a total stranger was standing right behind the glass, watching me. Around 3 a.m., I decided to check the DVR footage from the previous hour to see if anyone had approached the kiosk while I was in the restroom. I scrolled back through the footage and found the moment I had stepped out. The gatehouse was empty for about 3 minutes. During that window, a figure emerged from the shadows of the nearby trees. They weren't wearing a mask or a hood. It was just a man in a very ordinary dark-colored windbreaker and jeans. He looked like anyone you'd pass in a grocery store. He walked right up to the glass door of the kiosk. He didn't look around to see if he was being watched. He didn't look like a criminal. He looked like he was making a delivery. He reached into his pocket, pulled out the silver gift bag, and set it carefully on the counter through the window slot. But before he turned to leave, he did something that made my blood run cold. He leaned his face right up against the glass, looking directly into the camera lens for nearly 30 seconds. Then he checked his own wrist, not for a watch, but as if he was checking his pulse, and walked back into the darkness. I called the police that night. A deputy came out, took my statement, and looked at the footage. He recognized the man as Arthur, who lived in a small cabin a few miles down the highway. The deputy told me that Arthur was eccentric, but harmless, a guy who had lost his family in a car accident years ago and mostly kept to himself. The deputy seemed to think it was just a case of a confused man wandering onto the property and leaving something he thought belonged to me. He took the watch and told me he'd talk to Arthur the next day. I felt a little better, but the blank stare on the camera footage kept playing in my head. It wasn't the look of a confused man, it was the look of someone who was waiting. A few days later, the deputy called me back. He sounded different, less dismissive, more cautious. He told me he went to Arthur's cabin, but the place was empty. It looked like it hadn't been lived in for weeks. However, he found something in the shed out back. There were dozens of notebooks, all filled with the same handwriting. They weren't journals or stories, they were logs. For the past 3 years, someone had been documenting the movements of the night shift security guards at the logistics campus. There were descriptions of what we ate, what books we read, the license plate numbers of our cars, and even the times we went to the bathroom. But the most disturbing part was that the logs didn't start with me. They started years before I even moved to Washington. They were logs of people who held my specific job, going back over a decade. The deputy told me they found a photo pinned to the wall of the shed. It was a Polaroid of me, taken from a distance. I was sitting in my car at a red light in town months before I had even applied for the security job. I quit the next day. I didn't give notice, and I didn't go back for my final paycheck. I packed my things and moved 3 states away to live with my sister for a while. I changed my phone number and stayed off the grid as much as I could. It's been almost 10 years since then. I live in a city now, on the 4th floor of an apartment building with a heavy deadbolt and a security system. I try not to think about that job or the man in the windbreaker, but every once in a while, usually around late October, I'll be walking down the street or sitting in a quiet park, and I'll hear it, just for a second, a faint melodic whistling drifting through the air from somewhere just out of sight. I never turn around to look. I just keep walking, because I know that if I look, I might see him checking his pulse, waiting for the time to be exactly right.